Okay. Good morning, everyone. This is an open meeting of the U.S. Securities Exchange Commission on September 28, 2016, under the Government and Sunshine Act. The Commission today will consider three recommendations from the staff regarding the clearance and settlement system that is the essential foundation supporting the huge volumes of securities transactions that occur every day. First, we will consider rules under the Securities Exchange Act and the Dodd-Frank Act that would establish enhanced requirements for the risk management, operations, and governance of clearing agencies registered with the Commission. That portion of our agenda consists of two recommendations: one, to adopt final requirements for systemically important clearing agencies and certain other clearing agencies with a complex risk profile, and one that proposes to broaden the scope of the enhanced requirements to cover all registered clearing agencies that act as central counterparty, a central securities depository, or a securities settlement system. Next on our agenda is to consider a recommendation from the staff to shorten the standard settlement cycle for most broker-dealer transactions from 3 business days after the trade date, or T+3, to 2 business days after the trade date, or T+2. We'll begin with the recommendations for clearing agency requirements. The use of clearing agencies is critical to the safety and efficiency of securities trading, enabling billions of dollars of securities to change hands smoothly every day. At the same time, their centralized role in concentrating and managing financial exposures, which has grown significantly since the financial crisis, can raise systemic risk concerns. The Commission, as the key supervisory agency for securities clearing agencies, operates a comprehensive oversight program of the national clearance and settlement system. In recent years, in light of market and regulatory developments and an increasing focus and reliance on clearing services, particularly with respect to the clearing of credit default swaps and other security-based derivatives, the Commission has expanded its regulatory focus on clearing agency activities. Among other measures, we have expanded our examination and supervisory program, implemented strong new regulatory requirements, and developed new procedures for reviewing proposed rule changes by clearing agencies. In addition, Title VIII of the Dodd-Frank Act provides for enhanced regulation of financial market utilities that have been designated systemically important by the Financial Stability Oversight Council. Specifically, the Commission is authorized under Title VIII to prescribe risk management standards governing the operations of designated clearing agencies, and in doing so, to take into consideration international standards and existing prudential requirements. 5 Commission-registered clearing agencies have been designated by FSOC as systemically important, and the Commission serves as the supervisory agency for 4 of them. Today's recommendation would require covered clearing agencies to establish comprehensive policies and procedures related to governance and comprehensive risk management, with specific requirements addressing, among other things, the management of financial, liquidity, credit, operational, and general business risks. These new requirements, which build on standards first adopted by the Commission in 2012, would further enhance our regulatory program for clearing agencies by, among other things, ensuring that the risks inherent in the activities of designated clearing agencies and security-based swap clearing agencies are effectively managed. Taken together, the recommended requirements are robust enhancements to the management of the risks faced by designated and security-based swap clearing agencies, and will render them better able to withstand adverse events that may arise in stressed market conditions. In setting forth these requirements, the recommendation is cognizant of the global system of regulation that currently exists for clearing agencies that may be regulated by multiple authorities. The rules, for example, reflect careful consideration of the standards set forth in the Principles for Financial Market Infrastructures, PFMIs, published by the Committee for Payment and Settlement Systems and the International Organization of Securities Commissions, to which our staff significantly contributed. Our supervision and regulation of clearing agencies goes far beyond these new rule requirements. First and foremost, the statutory framework for the Commission's supervision of clearing agencies centers on their role as self-regulatory organizations. They are required to file changes with the Commission, everything from new credit facilities to reorganizations to access requirements. And our review and approval or disapproval of these changes is a powerful tool for oversight. The requirements being considered today thus do not stand alone, and they should not be viewed in a vacuum. They will be given life in the rule filing process. I expect the Commission and its staff to focus closely on evaluating proposed SRO rule changes to ensure that the rules before us today, which cover the full universe of clearing agencies and practices, are transformed into specific requirements uniquely tailored to each institution's risk profile. The Commission also conducts regular supervisory reviews and examinations of every systemically important clearing agency, reviewing everything from risk management practices to resource allocations to compliance frameworks. The implementation of the requirements being considered today will be reviewed closely in those reviews and examinations, where they can be evaluated concretely in the context of a clearing agency's specific risks. We must be clear-eyed about understanding how today's requirements are implemented, review that implementation regularly, and stand ready to make any changes necessary to further protect investors and the markets. Finally, it's important to remember that our requirements in this area are not static. Just as today's requirements improve on rules first adopted 4 years ago, so too will we continue to develop different or additional requirements for the evolving role of clearing in the modern securities markets. Even today, we are taking another step toward further enhancement in the rule proposal before us. That proposal would expand the enhanced requirements to all registered clearing agencies that act as a central counterparty, a central securities depository, or a securities settlement system. By applying the enhanced standards under consideration today to all registered clearing agencies, not just those designated as systemically important or as having a complex risk profile, the proposal would further strengthen the national system for clearance and settlement and help to further mitigate risk to the broader U.S. financial system. It is this kind of continual improvement and ongoing regulation that makes our clearance and settlement system so strong. And before I ask Steve Luparella, the Director of the Division of Trading and Markets, to kick off a discussion, a more detailed discussion of the staff recommendation, I'd like to thank Steve, his Deputy Director, Gary Gottschall, and Steve's counsel, Moshe Rothman, and his former counsel, Malou Huth, for their leadership on these rulemakings. I'd also like to thank Mark Flannery, Scott Bogus, and Vanessa Countryman for their leadership of the effort by the Division of Economic and Risk Analysis. We're deeply grateful to the clearing agency rulemaking team for all of its hard and continuing work over many years. Recognizing the complexity and importance of these rulemakings, I wish to thank Christian Sabella, Jeffrey Mooney, Stephanie Park, Matthew Lee, Elizabeth Fitzgerald, and DeCarlo McLaren from the Division of Trading and Markets, and Hari Patak and Parul Sharma from the Division of Economic and Risk Analysis. Many thanks also to Annie Small, Meredith Mitchell, Lori Price, Robert Tepley, and Donna Chambers from the Office of the General Counsel. In addition, I would like to thank many other staff throughout the agency for their contributions, including Paula Sherman from OSI, Catherine Martin, John Balcom, and Laura Compton from OIA, Wenchi Hu, Gina Lai, Carson McLean, and Roy Cheravelli from the Division of Trading and Markets. I would also like to note, if I can see out there, I think that Jennifer Marietta Westberg, I think you're here today, are you? Or if not, I'll say it in her absence. She very recently departed from the Commission after a decade of service, played a very important role in developing the staff's recommendation. I wanted to express again, as we have to Jennifer in the last few weeks at least, how deeply we appreciate her service to the Commission on this rule and so many others over the years. She's really been an extraordinary role model for all SEC staff and all of us, I would say. Finally, I would like to thank my fellow commissioners and all of our counsels for their engagement and comments on the recommendation. Now I will turn the meeting over to Steve Luparella to present the division's recommendation.
Thank you, Chair White, and good morning, Commissioners. Today we are recommending that the Commission adopt new rules under the Exchange Act and Title VIII of the Dodd-Frank Act to establish enhanced standards for certain clearing agencies that meet the definition of covered clearing agency. Under the recommended rules, covered clearing agencies, which are defined as any registered clearing agency that has been designated as systemically important by the FSOC and for which the Commission is the supervisory agency under Title VIII, and registered clearing agencies involved in activities with a more complex risk profile, including the clearing of securities-based swaps, would be subject to enhanced requirements, which build upon the requirements adopted in 2012 for registered clearing agencies more broadly. The rules recommended today would apply to all registered clearing agencies that meet the definition and would provide for a more comprehensive regulation of the activities of covered clearing agencies through the addition of a number of important new requirements, such as those addressing clearing agency governance, financial and operational risk management, and recovery and resolution. You will hear more about those particular requirements shortly. Importantly, the entities meeting the definition of CCA today act as CCPs for both derivatives and cash markets and perform the services of essential securities depository. Accordingly, these rules are designed to be at the same time robust and flexible so they can accommodate the full spectrum of activities that can be conducted by covered clearing agencies. Additionally, these rules will underpin the staff's supervision and oversight of covered clearing agencies, both in the review and approval of clearing agency rules and through our routine monitoring and examination functions. In developing the recommended rules, we carefully considered the global system of regulation that exists for clearance and settlement activity and sought to address instances where certain covered clearing agencies may be regulated by multiple authorities. In addition, as contemplated by Title VIII and as mentioned by you, we have considered the PFMI as the relevant international standard. We also consulted with FSOC, our colleagues at the CFTC, and the Board of Governors of the Federal Reserve System. The new rules represent an important step in our enhanced regulation and oversight of clearing agencies. But with these rules, our work is not done. To that end, we are also recommending that the Commission issue a proposal to amend the definition of covered clearing agency to include any registered clearing agency providing the services of essential counterparty, central securities depository, or securities settlement system. This would be an incremental change, but one that we believe is important to ensure that all clearing agencies registered with the Commission performing these critical functions are subject to the new enhanced requirements being proposed today. Before I invite Mark to offer his division's analysis of the final rules, I would also like to thank our colleagues in DERA for all of their hard work in drafting the adopting release. I'd also like to thank our colleagues in the Office of General Counsel and participating divisions and offices throughout the agency for their thoughtful and invaluable guidance in helping to formulate the recommendation. Finally, I'd like to thank your staff for the time and consideration you've afforded on these rules. The input from your offices was thoughtful and helped to shape the final recommendation. Taken together, we believe that the recommended rules, which reflect collaboration across the entire Commission and with other federal regulatory agencies, will facilitate appropriate and effective enhancements to the Commission's longstanding oversight of the national clearance and settlement system for the U.S. securities markets. I'll now turn it over to Mark.
Thank you, Steve. Good morning, Chair White and Commissioners. Today, staff are recommending that the Commission adopt rules to establish enhanced operational and governance standards for a set of registered clearing agencies that meet the definition of a covered clearing agency. Staff also propose amendments to the definition of covered clearing agency that would expand the scope of registered clearing agencies subject to these enhanced standards. In our analysis of the final rules establishing enhanced standards for covered clearing agencies, we have focused closely on how policies and procedures established pursuant to these rules could improve risk management by firms that play critical roles in the markets they serve, markets with global reach that often trade specialized financial instruments. While our analysis acknowledges that clearing agencies have incentives to effectively manage the risks they pose to their clearing members, it also notes that these incentives may not fully reflect the consequences of their risk management decisions on market participants more broadly. Our analysis also recognizes that enhanced standards may increase the cost associated with risk management. These costs could be passed through from covered clearing agencies to clearing members and from clearing members to investors. Higher costs may lead certain market participants to avoid trading altogether, reducing liquidity in cleared products and opportunities for risk sharing among investors in these markets. Further, these costs may raise already high barriers to entry in the market for clearance and settlement systems. They may inhibit the entry of new clearing agencies, or they may lead some clearing members to terminate their membership. At the same time, however, enhanced standards may reduce the likelihood of default by covered clearing agencies and their members, and could thereby increase efficiency and capital formation by reducing the transaction costs associated with counterparty default risk in cleared markets. We've also examined the potential economic effects of the proposal to amend the definition of covered clearing agency to include a broader range of registered clearing agencies. Based on the current set of registered clearing agencies and current practices at those agencies, we believe that the proposal would not have substantial economic effects in the short run. However, we anticipate that the proposal will improve financial stability over longer horizons because it would cover registered clearing agencies that perform activities that are critical to the markets they serve. Further, although we acknowledge that the proposed rules could raise barriers to entry for firms falling within its scope, we believe that imposing consistent requirements on clearing agencies that perform the same critical functions should provide a more level playing field for these firms. Finally, on behalf of DERA, I extend our thanks to the Office of General Counsel and to the Division of Trading and Markets for being such excellent partners as we worked on this rulemaking. We're happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Mark, and I concur on the partnership. I'll turn it over to Matt Lee to describe the rule and the accompanying proposal in more detail.
Thank you, Steve. Good morning, Chair White and Commissioners. We recommend that the Commission adopt Rule 1780-22E, which would impose new requirements for policies and procedures at covered clearing agencies in 23 specific areas. As noted by Steve, these requirements address a broad spectrum of clearing agency functions and activities. Among the key provisions are those relating to risk management matters, such as credit and liquidity risk management, settlement finality, money settlements, physical delivery risks, default rules and procedures, business risk, custody and investment risks, operational risk, and risk stemming from links and tiered participation arrangements. And also other important matters, such as the basis for its legal framework, its governance arrangements, the enforceability of its clearing and settlement arrangements, and increased transparency into its operations. Let me highlight a few of those key provisions. First, we would require covered clearing agencies to have policies and procedures to ensure they manage the liquidity risk of their activities by holding qualifying liquid resources sufficient to withstand the default of the participant family that would generate the largest aggregate payment obligation in extreme but plausible market conditions. The sufficiency of these qualifying liquid resources would be required to be tested through comprehensive stress testing, and the covered clearing agency would need to annually validate its liquidity risk models and have procedures in place to both address foreseeable liquidity shortfalls and replenish any liquid resources employed during stressed market conditions. In addition, a covered clearing agency also would be required to have policies and procedures for conducting due diligence on and annual testing of arrangements with its liquidity providers. Second, the recommended rule would enhance existing requirements for covered clearing agencies when managing credit risk and margin and include new requirements for collateral risk management. In particular, it includes new requirements for daily backtesting and stress testing and new requirements for conducting sensitivity analyses. These requirements would enhance covered clearing agencies' ability to withstand adverse events that may arise in stressed market conditions. Third, the recommended rule would require all covered clearing agencies to have policies and procedures reasonably designed to maintain a sound risk management framework for comprehensively managing legal, credit, liquidity, operational, general business, investment, custody, and other risks that arise in or are borne by the covered clearing agency. This framework would include plans for the recovery or orderly wind down of the covered clearing agency as caused by credit losses, liquidity shortfalls, losses from general business risk, or any other losses. As part of the sound risk management framework, the recommended rule contemplates an important new capital requirement for covered clearing agencies to manage general business risk, and which we believe would also be necessary to provide for an orderly transition in the event of a recovery or wind down. Specifically, covered clearing agencies would be required to have policies and procedures to hold sufficient liquid net assets funded by equity equal to at least 6 months of current operating expenses so that the covered clearing agency can continue operations during a recovery or wind down. Included in this rule would be requirements to have policies and procedures to, 1, have sufficient capital to account for business losses and allow the covered clearing agency to operate over a sufficient length of time to facilitate either its recovery or the effective transition of its operations, and 2, maintain a viable plan for raising additional equity should the covered clearing agency's equity fall close to or below the amount required. And with that, I'll turn it back to Steve.
Thank you, Matt. Chair White, that concludes our presentation. We would be happy to answer any questions that you and the commissioners have.
Thank you, Steve, Mark, and Matt. I do not have any further questions at this time, so I'll turn to Commissioner Stein for her questions and remarks on these two recommendations.
We've already asked lots and lots of questions, so sometimes this sounds a little scripted by the time we get to the meeting. But I want to thank the staff for their hard work in bringing these recommendations to the Commission. In particular, Jeffrey Mooney, Stephanie Park, Matthew Lee, Elizabeth Fitzgerald, DeCarlo McLaren, Jenna Lay, Carson McLean, Roy Cheravelli, Hari Fatak, Parul Sharma, Robert Tepley, Donna Chambers, and Paula Sherman. Today, the Commission is considering two staff proposals related to systemically important clearing agencies. The first is a final rule adopting standards for these systemically important clearing agencies. The second is a proposal to amend some of the definitions before us in the first proposal. In the late 60s and the early 70s, Wall Street nearly ground to a halt because manual back office processes could not keep up with the increasing volume of securities transactions. In fact, clearance and settlement problems actually led to the failure of numerous broker-dealers. To resolve what became known as the paperwork crisis, Congress directed the Commission to establish a safe, sound, and efficient clearance and settlement system. Importantly, the system was to have due regard for the public interest, the protection of investors, the safeguarding of securities and funds, and the maintenance of fair competition. Clearing agencies became a central part of this new system, and they stood in between market participants, helping to ensure securities were efficiently transferred and that they were paid for. They also improved investor confidence by providing a financial backstop for cleared securities transactions. Then in 2008, our nation experienced another crisis which almost brought the financial system to its knees. Concerns about the liquidity of some of the largest financial firms in the world caused market participants to question whether these firms could meet their financial obligations. And this worry spread throughout the financial markets, and it destabilized firms and businesses around the globe. The financial markets seized up as firms sought to minimize their counterparty risk exposure. In response to this crisis, Congress again passed legislation, the Dodd-Frank Wall Street Reform and Consumer Protection Act, and in particular, Title VII and Title VIII of the Act were designed to improve and enhance our markets' clearance and settlement systems. To address concerns about counterparty risk, these two sections of the Act sought to increase the use and the effectiveness of clearing agencies that stand in the middle of financial transactions. However, as mentioned already, while clearing agencies can help mitigate concerns about the solvency of individual counterparties, they can also potentially concentrate risk. As a result, Congress directed in Title VII that the Commission establish standards for security-based swapped clearing agencies. And Title VII directed the Commission to adopt risk management standards governing systemically important clearing agencies. Much like building codes, these standards are supposed to prevent or mitigate the spread of a fire. Congress did not want clearing agencies to be nodes of risk that could cause a new financial conflagration. History has shown us how important well-run clearing agencies are to the healthy functioning of our markets. And this is not an area where we can afford to be lax. We need to have clear, enforceable standards for clearing agencies to ensure they do not facilitate the transmission of risk, and that the clearance and settlement of securities can continue unimpeded even in stressed markets. This is what worries me about the standards being adopted today. While they are somewhat additive to the requirements that already exist, they simply fall short. There's just too much wiggle room. Standards for systemically important clearing agencies should be clear and unambiguous. For instance, the rule before us requires that covered clearing agencies who are clearing the most complicated and riskiest financial products use models to figure out what will happen when the markets experience stress. This sounds good. However, the rule qualifies this requirement. It says such analysis only needs to be done when it's relevant or where it's practical. These terms are vague and left for the clearing agencies to interpret. This is sort of like requiring a construction company that is building a skyscraper to only comply with the building standards it wants to follow. This does not necessarily take into account what is in the public interest or is good for the surrounding community or buildings. Although I believe this rule should have been stronger, and I tried to make it so, this rule is long past due. It has been 8 years since the financial crisis, and 6 years since Congress enacted the Dodd-Frank Act. Therefore, I will vote for this rule today, but only because it marginally decreases the risk posed by systemically important clearing agencies. Which leads me to the second rulemaking, the proposal on definitions related to clearing agencies. This release reproposes certain definitions contained within the covered clearing rule I've been discussing. However, it also could have provided a means to improve some of the weaknesses I just discussed. This is a missed opportunity to strengthen our oversight of systemically important clearing agencies so that they can better withstand market disruptions and panics. I invite commenters to use this second proposal to comment on ways we can improve our clearing agency standards going forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner Pivovar.
Thank you, Chair White. I want to start by joining my colleagues in thanking the staff for their hard work on these releases that would establish new requirements for risk management, operations, and governance of certain registered clearing agencies and propose amendments to our clearing agency definitions. As we've heard, clearing agencies are vital pieces of our market infrastructure, and their role in the financial markets is only increasing. That is why I want to express my particular appreciation to the staff for the thoughtful way in which they develop these requirements, which is based on our own history and experience of regulating clearing agencies, applicable international guidance, and feedback from market participants and other regulators. This was no easy task, and the quality of these releases is a testament to your efforts. As Steve mentioned, the topic of clearing agency oversight has been dominated recently by the PFMI. Around the world, regulators are being pressured to conform to these standards. It must have been tempting for staff to merely seek to codify PFMI and then congratulate themselves for a job well done. This would have been the easy approach, but it would have been the wrong approach. Simply porting over international standards would have failed to fully account for the agency's obligation to regulate these entities under the mandates of the Securities Exchange Act of 1934, and ignored the unique perspectives we have gained through years of supervision in this area. I support both the adopting and proposing releases we are voting on today because they reflect a staff decision not to take the easy way out. Rather, they correctly seek to establish effective regulation tailored to the Commission's unique mandate and experiences, while creating a regulatory structure that is consistent with PFMI. The tremendous pressure to align our rules with the PFMI throughout this rulemaking process brought to my mind another situation in which the Commission acted based on pressures from international prudential regulators. In 2004, the Commission adopted rule amendments to the broker-dealer net capital rule that established the Consolidated Supervised Entity Program. That program was implemented in response to international developments in prudential regulation. As a result of these developments, affiliates of certain U.S. broker-dealers that conducted business in the European Union needed to demonstrate that they were subject to consolidated supervision at the ultimate holding company level that was, quote, equivalent, unquote, to EU consolidated supervision. The CSE program was intended to meet that standard. The Commission's faithful implementation of the CSE program, however, could not compensate for the fundamental flaws in the international prudential regulatory framework, the so-called Basel Accord that led to the global financial crisis. In the aftermath of the financial crisis, the same prudential regulators who pressured the Commission into submitting to the Basel Accord spread a variety of false narratives blaming the CSE program for the financial crisis rather than acknowledging their own failures. Like the CSE program, the Commission has once again been called upon by the international prudential regulatory community to implement new regulations aimed at addressing risks in the financial system, this time related to clearing agencies and other financial market infrastructures. And again, we have acted in a manner consistent with those standards, as have this time the CFTC and the Fed. I can only hope that history will not repeat itself and we will not once again be left defending a regulatory system that was doomed from the start. As I've said many times, the current regulatory state of central counterparty clearing agency regulations is one of the things that keeps me awake at night. To be clear, this is not because I question the abilities of our staff at the Commission or the usefulness of the enhanced rules in today's releases. I know that we have an incredible team of people working day and night to supervise these entities, and I credit staff for their careful consideration of how our new rules can best address the risks to the clearing system. Unfortunately, I'm concerned that even our best supervisory programs cannot overcome bad policy decisions. In early discussions surrounding the post-crisis financial reform, Dodd-Frank policymakers settled on CCPs as a near miraculous way to address risks in the financial system. For example, former CFTC Chairman Gary Gensler said, quote, "By guaranteeing the performance of contracts submitted for clearing, the clearing process significantly reduces systemic risk," unquote. Soon, policymakers began to view these long-standing cogs in the market infrastructure as giant boxes that took in risk and then, poof, magically eliminated it from the system. With this simplistic view of markets in hand, policymakers then determined that the most effective way to address risks in the system was to cram as many transactions as possible into CCPs via the Dodd-Frank Act's extensive clearing mandate. For example, former Treasury Secretary Tim Geithner said, quote, "We will force all standardized OTC derivatives contracts to be cleared through appropriately designed central counterparties," unquote. Thus, in an effort to reduce risk to the financial system, Dodd-Frank Act policymakers jammed more and more increasingly risky and complex financial products into these critical infrastructures. Not surprisingly, it didn't take long for market participants and some regulators alike to recognize that in their efforts to reduce systemic risk, the Dodd-Frank Act did the exact opposite. It created an entirely new class of too-big-to-fail entities with the power to bring down the entire financial system. This fact is openly acknowledged in the two releases we are voting on today and is never far from my mind, particularly when considering the Commission's uphill battle to oversee CCPs operating under ill-conceived government clearing mandates. While I believe the staff has done an admirable job setting up a principles-based framework for CCPs to manage these risks to the best of their ability, I still fear that ultimately these entities, in the international norms designed to mitigate their risks, will not be able to account for the short-sighted effort by those in Congress and the regulatory agencies that sought to cram as much risk as they could into these entities. I support today's adopting and proposing releases as the best approach we currently have at setting heightened standards for the clearing agencies that we regulate. However, this entire effort has the eerie feeling of rearranging deck chairs on the Titanic. I hope that history will prove me wrong, but I fear that the Dodd-Frank Act has created too many icebergs for our financial system to safely navigate. Thank you. I have no questions.
Thank you. Unless there are any other comments or questions, we'll take votes on these two recommendations separately. We'll first take a vote on the recommendation for final rules. Do the Commissioners vote to approve the recommendation to adopt rules to establish enhanced standards for the operation and governance of certain clearing agencies pursuant to Section 17A of the Securities Exchange Act of 1934 and Title VIII of the Dodd-Frank Act? Please indicate your vote by saying yes or no.
Yes.
Yes.
Yes, the recommendation is unanimously approved. Now we'll take a vote on the recommendation for the proposed rule on clearing agencies. Do the Commissioners vote to approve the recommendations to propose amendments to certain definitions in Rule 17AD-22 related to clearing agencies pursuant to Section 17A of the Securities Exchange Act of 1934 and Title VIII of the Dodd-Frank Act? Please indicate your vote by saying yes or no.
Yes.
Yes.
Yes, that recommendation is also approved unanimously. Thank you. We will now turn to the third agenda item from Trading and Markets regarding the settlement cycle, and we'll allow a moment for the staff teams to change seats at the table. I think you have some changes. Okay. Only minimal. Okay. All right. Very good. Just let me know. Ready to go? Okay. No standard settlement cycle was mandated actually for much of the Commission's history. When the Commission first established one in 1993, T+3, which was shorter than the industry practice of T+5, we articulated a number of reasons for standardizing and shortening the settlement cycle. These benefits included, among others, reducing credit and market risk exposure related to unsettled trades, reducing liquidity risk among derivatives and cash markets, encouraging greater efficiency in the clearance and settlement process, and reducing systemic risk. It is now time to move forward again, this time to consider a T+2 cycle, so that similar benefits can again be realized for investors, intermediaries, and other market participants. In the years since the standardized settlement cycle was first established, the Commission has actively studied and considered proposals to shorten the settlement cycle. Today, a combination of both industry and regulatory initiatives has led to continuing developments in technology and processes, and in particular, further immobilization and dematerialization of securities and enhanced institutional trade matching utilities that have laid the foundation for a shorter settlement cycle. Doing so remains a major undertaking. The complexity of the clearance and settlement process and the wide range of participants that interact with and rely on the workflows within that process makes simple fixes impractical and requires more than advances in technology. Today's proposal is intended to capitalize on the Commission's prior work on shortening the settlement cycle and support the industry's ongoing efforts to successfully migrate to a T+2 standard settlement cycle. I've supported this multi-stakeholder effort from the beginning, as have my colleagues on the Commission now and previously, and I hope the Commission's action today will give market participants the necessary momentum to complete their efforts. I recognize there will be costs for market participants to take on this significant endeavor. However, I believe that shortening the settlement cycle should yield important benefits that ultimately flow to investors, including reduced clearing capital requirements for broker-dealers, reduced pro-cyclical margin and liquidity demands on market participants, and increased global harmonization of settlement cycles. In moving forward today, it is critical that we maintain an unwavering commitment to act in the best interests of investors and the markets. Important voices from the Investor Advisory Committee to many large institutional investors have already been heard on these issues. Today's proposal will solicit input from a wider audience as to the benefits and costs of a T+2 standard settlement cycle, as well as alternatives such as T+1 or T+0. While there's been extensive analysis of a move to T+2, as well as recent experiences in foreign markets to study, there is relatively less analysis and experience around further reductions to the standard settlement cycle. I believe that today's Commission can best fulfill its commitment to serving investors and the markets by pursuing today's proposal to move to T+2. However, I would expect that future commissions, like ours is today, will review whether further reductions would be appropriate in light of the technology, investor needs, and all other relevant circumstances at the time. So before I again ask Steve Luparella, our Director of Trading and Markets, to provide additional details on the recommendation, I would like to thank Steve again, Gary Gottschall as well, as their counsel, Moshe Rothman, and their former counsel, Malou Huth. This sounds like a little deja vu for their leadership on this rulemaking. I would also like to, again, very sincerely and especially commend the core rulemaking team for their hard and exceptional work. In particular, Christian Sabella, Jeffrey Mooney, Natasha Vigreiner, Justin Pica, Susan Peterson, Andrew Shanbrom, and Jonathan Shapiro from the Division of Trading and Markets, Jennifer Marietta Westberg, Vanessa Countryman, Hari Patak, and Charles Lynn from the Division of Economic and Risk Analysis. Again, many thanks to Annie Small, Meredith Mitchell, Lori Price, Robert Tepley, Cynthia Ginsburg, and Leela Baum from the Office of the General Counsel. In addition, I'd like to thank many other staff throughout the agency for their contributions, including Jonathan Ingram and Heather Maples from the Division of Corporation Finance, Doug Scheit, Sarah Ten-Sitoff, Kathy Joaquin, and Jennifer Palmer from the Division of Investment Management, Raymond Lombardo, Timothy Fox, Josephine Tao, and Darren Vieira from the Division of Trading and Markets. Finally, I would like to express my gratitude to my fellow commissioners and all of our councils for their support, engagement, and comments on this proposal. Now I will ask Steve, as well as Mark Flannery, to provide us additional details.
Thank you again, Chair White. We are pleased to recommend for the Commission's consideration a proposal to shorten the standard settlement cycle for a significant number of U.S. securities transactions from 3 business days after trade date, which we refer to as T+3, to 2 business days after trade date, which is obviously referred to as T+2. This proposal is an important step in the Commission's ongoing efforts to reduce risks and costs and increase efficiencies in the U.S. clearance and settlement system. The Division believes that shortening the standard settlement cycle to T+2 will benefit all market participants through a reduction in credit, market, and liquidity risk with a corresponding reduction in systemic risk. As noted by our prior proposals, this is part of a multi-pronged effort to strengthen the clearance and settlement system. The Division believes shortening the standard settlement cycle at this time is consistent with that effort and with the Commission's broader focus on enhancing the resilience and efficiency of the national clearance and settlement system and the role that CCPs and other financial market infrastructures play in managing that risk. Since the move from T+5 to T+3 in 1993, the Commission and market participants have continued to explore the possibility of further shortening the standard settlement cycle. More recently, those efforts have coalesced into a broad industry initiative to shorten the standard cycle to T+2. As part of this initiative, substantial efforts have been made to identify all of the regulatory changes that we would need to make to support a move to that shorter cycle. At the same time, the industry has laid out a detailed implementation timeline with milestones and dependencies necessary to migrate to T+2. The Division appreciates the industry's substantial efforts. We believe the proposal being considered today would support those efforts and have far-reaching benefits for all market participants, including retail investors and many cross-border counterparties to transactions in U.S. securities. Before I again invite Mark to offer DERA's analysis of the economic impact of the proposed amendment, I would again like to thank our colleagues in DERA for all of their hard work and support on this release. I'd also like to thank our colleagues in OGC and participating divisions and offices throughout the agency for their thoughtfulness and invaluable guidance in helping to formulate this proposal. Finally, I'd like to thank the staff of you and the commissioners for the time and consideration you afforded us on this proposal. I'll now turn it over to Mark.
Thank you, Steve. Good morning, Chair White and Commissioners. DERA's examination of the economic effects of shortening the standard settlement cycle for most broker-dealer transactions has focused on the potential reduction of risk for U.S. market participants. First, reducing the length of time a transaction remains unsettled will reduce the amount of credit, market, and liquidity risk faced by the counterparties to that transaction, including the central counterparties. Second, the shorter settlement cycle will mean that for a fixed volume of transactions, fewer transactions remain unsettled at any given time, reducing the aggregate level of settlement-related risks faced by the market. As the level of financial risk related to clearance and settlement decreases, we believe that the costs of managing and mitigating those risks will decrease as well. Our analysis also notes that market frictions may make it difficult for market participants to shorten the settlement cycle in the absence of our regulatory intervention. A transition to a shorter settlement cycle would require numerous market participants to simultaneously perform system upgrades and testing. Market participants may be reluctant to make those costly upgrades if they are uncertain about whether others will take the same actions. In other words, market participants may confront what we call a coordination problem that can be addressed by this proposed rulemaking. If all market participants must adjust their systems at the same time, each individual participant has the proper incentive to perform such upgrades. Because many of the potential benefits of the shorter settlement cycle accrue to the U.S. financial system as a whole, market participants acting on their own may not consider those benefits when deciding whether or not to upgrade. Some market participants may opt out of a voluntary transition to a shorter settlement cycle, even if such a shorter settlement cycle would be more efficient for securities markets overall. Our analysis considers the costs that the proposed amendments are likely to impose on market participants, as well as the potential consequences these costs could have on competition between clearing members and third-party service providers. We preliminarily believe that the potential costs of the proposed amendment are appropriate when considering the potential reductions in credit, market, and liquidity risks that may benefit all market participants. Our analysis notes that the economic effects of the shortened settlement cycle could vary across market participants based on their size, their role, and the markets they serve. The release requests data and other information from commenters that would help refine our estimates of the economic effects across these different participant groups. As always, and in conclusion, I wish to thank the Office of the General Counsel and the Division of Trading and Markets for being excellent partners in this rulemaking. In particular, I want to express my appreciation for the relentless work of the staff from the Office of Clearance and Settlement, with whom we collaborated closely throughout the process. Thank you, and we're happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Mark. I will now ask Jeff Mooney to describe the proposal in greater detail.
Thank you, Steve. Good morning, Chair White and Commissioners. Today we are recommending for the Commission's consideration a proposal to amend Exchange Act Rule 15C61A that would shorten the standard settlement cycle for most securities transactions from T3 to T2. Specifically, the proposal would amend Rule 15C61A to prohibit a broker-dealer from effecting or entering into a contract for the purchase or sale of a security that provides for payment of funds and delivery of securities later than the second business day after the date of the contract, unless otherwise expressly agreed to by the parties at the time of the transaction. We are not proposing any amendments to the remaining provisions of Rule 15C61A, which provide exemptions from the rule for certain types of securities and would remain unchanged by the proposal. As noted by others, the proposal is part of a larger industry-wide initiative. Of note, in December 2015, a T2 industry implementation playbook was published, which sets forth a detailed implementation timeline with milestones and dependencies and identified many activities that impacted market participants should consider in connection with any future migration to a T2 settlement cycle. Division staff has been monitoring many of the industry and clearing agency work streams that have arisen as a part of the playbook's timeline, and we will continue to do so as the industry starts to consider the necessary process and systems changes and eventually begins testing. The industry has set a target date of September 5, 2017 for implementation of a T2 standard settlement cycle and is moving forward to prepare testing schedules based on that date. Although we are sensitive to the industry's efforts to move forward on this timetable, the proposal solicits comment on that date as well as the parameters that should guide the Commission in identifying an appropriate implementation date. I'll now turn it back to Steve.
Thank you, Jeff. Chair White, that concludes our presentation. We are happy to answer any questions that you and the commissioners may have.
Thank you, Steve, Mark, and Jeff, and also for the relentless work. I don't have any further questions at this time. Commissioner Stein?
I also would like to thank the staff for the relentless work in trading and markets and DERA for your hard work on this proposal to shorten the settlement cycle for securities transactions. In particular, I want to thank Jeffrey Mooney, Susan Peterson, Natasha Grainer, Charles Lynn, and Hari Fatak. As I noted earlier, the clearance and settlement process has evolved dramatically over the past several decades. Computers and clearinghouses have helped shorten the time to transfer and pay for securities. Today's third release seeks to update a rule that was actually created in 1993. This rule concerns how quickly securities trades must settle after the trade date. As noted by staff, this particular proposal would require securities trades to settle within 2 days of the actual trade. Faster settlement should reduce risk faced by retail and institutional investors, broker-dealers, custodial banks, central clearing parties, systemically important financial market utilities, and central counterparties. Each of these market participants faces various risks the longer the period between trade execution and settlement. Just a one-day change will help mitigate the risks of an unnecessarily long settlement cycle that have persisted despite rapid improvements in technology. Longer settlement periods are associated with increased counterparty default risk, market risk, liquidity risk, credit risk, and overall systemic risk. A shorter settlement time should also make the market more efficient. Moreover, given the advances in computer hardware and software already in use by market participants, the move to T+2 is not only possible, but also should lay the groundwork for an even shorter settlement cycle. Shortening the settlement cycle will involve changes and costs that may impact our payment system as a whole. I also invite commenters to weigh in on their experiences in foreign jurisdictions which have already transitioned to a shorter settlement cycle. In particular, I would like to thank Commissioner Pivar today for all of his work on this issue. I look forward to receiving people's best thoughts and comments on this proposal. Thank you.
Thank you. Commissioner Pivar.
Thank you, Chair White. I enthusiastically support this proposal to shorten the trade settlement cycle. Indeed, I've been quite vocal about the fact I would have preferred for us to consider this rulemaking long ago. The Commission's agenda is admittedly crowded, but rarely is an issue as commonsensical as this one. Shortening the trade settlement cycle has garnered broad support from a wide array of interests, including investor advocates, research organizations, and market participants. The Commission's Investor Advisory Committee has gone so far to say that, quote, with perhaps only one or two exceptions, we cannot think of any other higher impact measure that is within reach that does not potentially have other adverse consequences, unquote. An industry steering committee has suggested the benefits of shortening the settlement cycle would be immediate. And even the Commission itself, in connection with the shift from a 5-day settlement cycle to 3 days over a decade ago, acknowledged that the benefits of a shorter settlement cycle inure to all market participants. These glowing sentiments are not hyperbole. As has been discussed at length already today and in detailed submissions to the Commission, shortening the trade settlement cycle is expected to reduce counterparty credit, liquidity, and market risks. It will increase capital efficiency and improve investor protection. And it will align trade processing in the United States to many other global markets. Years from now, U.S. investors will be puzzled about how a T3 settlement cycle existed for so long. As such, this proposal for me is a no-brainer, a slam dunk, a cakewalk, pick your favorite metaphor. While the proposal would shorten the current 3-day trade settlement cycle to 2 days, the release also asks questions about moving to a 1-day trade settlement cycle. I preliminarily understand that a T1 settlement cycle would produce distinct challenges and generate costs magnitudes above a T2 settlement cycle, but I encourage commenters to tell us whether that is true and also identify the costs and benefits of each alternative relative to one another. And to the extent the Commission adopts a rule for T2, what, if anything, should we do with respect to further shortening the settlement cycle in the future? Before I close, let me offer a few notes of gratitude. First, I want to join my fellow commissioners and thank the Commission's dedicated staff for your work in bringing this impactful and concise proposal to fruition. Thank you for being concise. Also, widespread praise is owed to the various outside individuals and groups who have advocated for a rulemaking to shorten the trade settlement cycle and laid the groundwork on which this proposal stands. Your white papers, letters, recommendations, and analyses have been of tremendous assistance. Finally, I want to thank my colleagues. Commissioner Stein, my fellow T2 Terminator, you've been a wonderful partner in advocating for this proposal. Chair White, thank you for making room on a busy agenda for this important rulemaking. While today's rulemaking is only a proposal, Stay tuned. We'll be back. Thank you. I have no questions.
Thank you. Unless there are any other questions or comments from the commissioners, we'll take a vote on this recommendation. And again, please indicate your vote by saying yes or no. Do the commissioners vote to approve the recommendation to propose amendments to Rule 15C6-1 under the Securities Exchange Act of 1934 to shorten the standard settlement cycle for the specified broker-dealer transactions from 3 business days after the trade date to 2 business days after the trade date?
Yes.
Yes.
Yes. Okay, thank you. The recommendation is unanimously approved. And thank you. That concludes our agenda for today. We are adjourned.